Our School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University, the sponsor of this symposium. And it's my pleasure to be with you to open this important event on a vital issue for international affairs. How do we understand the most significant trends taking place in Asia? And how do those trends affect American national security interests and prospects for peace and security at the global level? This is the first in a series of annual conferences organized by the Schar School's Center for Security Policy Studies. Each fall, the center will take on a topic of long-term consequence in the international security field, drawing on scholarly work by Mason's faculty and students, and in collaboration with other great experts around the country and around the world. The center is led by Professor Ellen Leibson, who has been at the Schar School now for a year, after a distinguished career in government and as president of the Stimson Center from 2002 until 2015, when we took her away and brought her to the Schar School. I will pass the baton to her shortly to direct the proceedings for the rest of the day after the opening keynote. And on that point, by the way, my apologies for not being here for the rest of the day. We have an annual Dean's Retreat with the Provost once a year, which happens to be today in Fairfax. And the Provost informs us that the only good reason for missing is you're attending your own funeral. So this doesn't count, as important as it is. But Ellen tells me this is going to be taped, and I'm going to watch the presentations. I'm a frequent traveler to China. I'm not a China expert, but have lectured there at many universities around the country, and I'm also Chinese by marriage, so that counts too. So I'm very interested in developments in Asia more broadly, and especially in China. The Schar School is also home to the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, led by our colleague Louise Shelley, who is here, and to the Mike Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. That will be having a special event, by the way, on September 11th in the evening with several distinguished guests. So take a look at our website and see about that program. It promises to be a really terrific one. Together with the Center for Security Policy Studies, our school is deeply engaged in examining the full suite of challenges, threats, and opportunities for international security. And also, we've been recognized as a rising star in the U.S. academic world for these activities. We commenced a couple of years ago a new master's degree program in international security studies. I love telling people how many experts told us, don't do it, it'll never work. And it has been our fastest growing master's degree program, and in the inaugural ranking of such programs by U.S. News and World Report, we came in number 3 in the country, right behind Harvard. We're coming after them next year in the rankings. So it's my distinct pleasure, though, to introduce Professor Alan Friedberg from Princeton University, one of the leading voices in the country on the future of U.S.-China relations. We thought this topic was essential to framing the discussion, and we know Professor Friedberg will challenge and stimulate our thinking about the range of possible paths for U.S.-China relations and their consequences for security in Asia and beyond. You have his detailed biography of scholarly work on strategic issues over a 3-decades-long career. So let me just highlight a few key points that demonstrate his intellectual leadership on Asia and China issues in particular. Professor Friedberg is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, where he has taught since 1987, and co-director of the Woodrow Wilson Center on International Security Studies. He writes frequently on China and U.S.-China relations, most recently in a survival article entitled Competing with China. In 2011, he published A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia, which has been translated into multiple languages. His most recent monograph, Beyond Air-Sea Battle, the Debate over U.S. Military Strategy in Asia, was published in May 2014 as part of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a Delphi paper series. In 2001-2002, Professor Friedberg was selected as the first occupant of the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress. Dr. Friedberg served from June 2003 to June 2005 as Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs in the Office of the Vice President. After leaving government, he was appointed to the Defense Policy Board and the Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on Democracy Promotion. But it is a special meaning to add to his credentials his role as mentor and advisor to two of our very talented faculty members who are here this morning, Professors Colin Dueck and Mike Hunsiker. Thank you for that and giving them to us. They and the Schar School are working to embody Professor Friedberg's commitment to improving strategic education for rising national security experts. We are honored, therefore, to welcome Professor Friedberg to open this symposium. Please.
Thank you very much, Dean Rozelle. My sympathies on your provost meeting.
This goes with the job.
I know. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and particularly to be here with some old friends, Professor Leibson, and as the dean mentioned, two former students of mine, Mike Hunsiker and Colin Dueck. I'm glad to see them doing so well. It's a little frightening to me to think that they are professors who have graduate students of their own, but that's sort of the way the world works. The subject of today's conference is the Asian century and what it may mean for the United States. And in my remarks, I'd like to narrow this topic somewhat. I want to concentrate on the rise of China, or more specifically, the recent, rapid, and still ongoing expansion in the wealth, power, and influence of the Chinese nation under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. If there's to be an Asian century, this phenomenon will likely be both its defining feature and the driving force behind it. My purpose today is to offer a prescription, or rather a description and a diagnosis, rather than any detailed prescriptions for policy. And to put the bottom line up front, I think that China's rise represents a challenge and indeed a danger to the United States and other democratic countries, not primarily because of its growing wealth and power, but because of the oppressive, authoritarian character of its domestic political regime. The nature of the CCP regime and its prevailing ideology shapes and is reflected in the preoccupations of its leaders, the ways in which they define their goals, and the policies with which they seek to attain them. So if I had to put it in a bumper sticker, I'd say it's not the rise, it's the regime. As a number of scholars have pointed out, in the longer sweep of history, what's often described as China's rise really marks its return to a position of regional and global preeminence. This is certainly true in the economic domain. As recently as 2 centuries ago, China had the world's largest economy, and if current trends continue, it may soon again. Indeed, by some measures, it already does. And seen in this light, China's rise or its return may seem like a natural phenomenon, a reversion to the historical norm. But of course, it was by no means inevitable. China's recent economic success is a tribute to the industriousness and the ingenuity of the Chinese people, to be sure, but it's also a product of politics, and in particular of 2 sets of deliberate policy choices that were made on opposite sides of the Pacific. First, the decisions by other governments, Western governments, starting in the early 1970s and led by the United States, to encourage China's reintegration into the global economy and into the full array of mostly Western-designed and led international institutions. And this began, of course, as a Cold War gambit, using China to help balance against the Soviet Union. But this general approach soon took on a life of its own and became the centerpiece of the approach that the United States has followed ever since. Second, the decision of Xi Jinping in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in the wake of the Cultural Revolution and after the death of Chairman Mao, to abandon the disruptive and deeply counterproductive economic policies of his predecessor and to begin what was referred to as a policy of reform and opening up, shrinking the role of the state in planning and controlling every aspect of economic life and increasing the scope of market forces, and as part of that effort, seeking to integrate China into the global economy. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has pursued a mixed two-pronged strategy for dealing with China. On the one hand, engagement in every domain, diplomatically, continuing with the policies established under the Nixon administration, the so-called opening to China, through scientific and educational cooperation, large-scale transfers of technology and know-how from the United States to China through various means, including the training of first tens and then hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in American colleges and universities, and above all, engagement in the economic sphere. Trade and investment flows started to increase in the 1980s with reform and opening up as those policies got going. Those flows were disrupted for a time after the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, when the United States and other countries imposed sanctions on China. But then they were resumed and indeed expanded during the 1990s, and these ties, economic ties, exploded after 2001 with China's entry, with American assistance, into the World Trade Organization. So engagement on the one hand. At the same time, successive U.S. administrations have also worked to maintain a favorable balance of military power in the Asia-Pacific region by keeping U.S. forces there even after the Cold War was over, and by strengthening ties with traditional allies like Japan and South Korea, and also quasi-alliance partners like India or Singapore, or more recently, Vietnam. The objectives of this two-pronged strategy were to preserve stability and to deter any possibility of aggression, while effectively waiting for engagement to work its magic on China. And the assumption was that through engagement, the United States, the Western countries, would encourage China to become what was referred to in the Bush administration as a responsible stakeholder in the existing international order, to cause its leaders to see their interests as lying in the preservation and strengthening of that order rather than in attempts to change it fundamentally, still less to overthrow it. So by welcoming China in to help transform it into a status quo power. It was also believed that engagement, especially economic engagement, would serve to accelerate the process of economic liberalization that would move China steadily towards a true Western-style market economy. And last but not least, it was believed that this process of engagement would promote forces that would lead eventually to China's political liberalization. That trade and investment with China would fuel its growth, that growth would lead to the emergence of a middle class in China, and as had happened elsewhere, both in Europe and in Asia, the middle class would act as the standard bearer for political reform. This belief, bolstered by liberal ideology and also by modern social science, was widely shared on both sides of the aisle in American politics, and it became the single most important part of the public rationale for engagement. And just to give you one example, a speech by George W. Bush during the 2000 presidential campaign in which he said, quote, "Economic freedom creates habits of liberty, and habits of liberty create expectations of democracy. Trade freely with China, and time is on our side." Of course, American policy was not rooted solely or entirely in altruism. There was also an expectation that trading freely with China would be good for the U.S. economy. Especially in the past decade, it's become apparent that this mixed approach has failed to achieve its central strategic objectives. China has grown far richer and much stronger, and it's done so at an astonishing pace. And trade with China has benefited American consumers and at least some sectors of the U.S. economy. But the Chinese Communist Party regime has not liberalized, either politically or economically. And far from becoming a satisfied status quo power, China has begun to behave in ways that are assertive and even aggressive. It's attempting to alter the balance of power and pursuing revisionist aims, both in its own immediate neighborhood and increasingly on the global level as well. And it's the dawning awareness of these realities, I think, that lies behind the current debate over whether, and if so how, to reshape key elements of U.S.-China strategy. So in the time that remains, I'd like to discuss the four troubling symptoms to which I referred a moment ago. The persistent and indeed growing repressiveness of the CCP regime, its continued and in fact in certain respects expanding use of mercantilist economic policy tools, its increasingly evident regional revisionism, and its emerging global ambitions. The deepest cause of the failure of U.S. strategy can be found in the resilience, resolve, and ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party, its determination at all costs to retain its exclusive grip on domestic political power. Conversely, it's the CCP's success, the fact that China continues to be governed by a repressive authoritarian regime, that lies at the heart of many of the challenges that it poses to the United States and the other democracies of the world. From the start, the CCP leadership was aware that the process of engaging with the outside world would be risky to its continued rule. Deng Xiaoping famously said that opening the windows would let in flies as well as fresh air. He believed that economic reform was essential to China's prospects for once again becoming a truly great power, but he was also keenly aware that subversive ideas and outside influences could encourage dissent and produce unwanted pressures for political change. In other words, he feared that the Americans might be right. So, especially after what's referred to by the Chinese leadership euphemistically as the Tiananmen incident in 1989, the CCP leadership put into place a set of policies meant to counteract and contain the potentially destabilizing political effects of openness and economic reform. By allowing the Chinese people to enjoy more of the fruits of their own labors, the regime hoped to win their loyalty, or at least their acquiescence. In addition, Beijing greatly expanded its investments in the tools of surveillance and repression, including multiple overlapping domestic security forces and an increasingly elaborate and expensive system of controls over the internet and more recently over social media. Last but not least, the regime designed and began to implement a major nationwide program of what is referred to as patriotic education. This is essentially an ideological substitute for Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, which the leadership recognized had lost much of its appeal to ordinary Chinese people, that seeks to bolster popular support for the regime by encouraging a particular form of Chinese nationalism or patriotism. And it's a particular form that emphasizes not so much the great achievements of Chinese civilization, but the so-called century of humiliation that begins with the Opium Wars in the 1840s and the vital and continuing role of the Chinese Communist Party in restoring national dignity. All of these elements have remained in place down to the present, although their relative weights have shifted somewhat. As economic growth has slowed in recent years, China's leaders have cracked down even harder on dissent and on the population more generally, and they've stepped up their use of nationalism, including by courting confrontations with foreign powers in the hopes of rallying domestic support. And I think these tendencies have been visible for some time, but they've become especially obvious since Xi Jinping assumed leadership of the party state 5 years ago. The expanded resources that the CCP regime has available to it have given it a widening array of options for crushing dissent and suppressing criticism of its policies, both at home and abroad. As many of you are probably aware, the Chinese government is reportedly moving towards implementation of what's referred to as a nationwide social credit system that would use big data analytics and facial recognition software and maybe DNA sampling on a national scale to monitor the activities, to track the movements, and to assess the political reliability of virtually every man, woman, and child in China. And this is a capability that the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century could only dream of. But it's not all high technology. There's growing evidence that Beijing has built a network of detention facilities or concentration camps that may hold as many as 1 million members of China's Uyghur Muslim minority, nearly 10% of that population, people that the regime fears may be susceptible to radicalism. And prisoners in this network of camps are reportedly being subjected to intense psychological pressure, a form of torture, intended to re-educate them, and many have not been heard of since being detained. This appears to be a violation of human rights on a truly massive scale, and yet to date, very few Western governments have seen fit to comment on it, presumably, at least in part, because they fear damaging valuable economic relationships with China. And indeed, China's increasing wealth and the growing importance of its market have enhanced the regime's ability to exert leverage over foreigners, including both governments and private actors who dare to criticize its human rights policies or otherwise incur its wrath. When the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident in 2010, Beijing responded by freezing relations and imposing unofficial economic sanctions for 6 years, relenting only after the Norwegian government issued an apology saying that it would, quote, do its best to avoid any future damage to bilateral relations. When the University of California at San Diego invited Tibet's exiled Dalai Lama to deliver a commencement address in 2017, the Chinese authorities responded by cutting aid for visiting scholars and implicitly threatening to do the same for the much larger number of Chinese students studying at UCSD. This year, when an employee of the Marriott hotel chain liked a social media tweet posted by an organization called the Friends of Tibet, Beijing demanded that he be fired and that Marriott issue an apology. And he was fired, and they did issue an apology. 30 years ago, there may have been a good case to be made for downplaying the CCP regime's mistreatment of its own people and proceeding with engagement in the belief that this would help speed political reform. And indeed, for a time, the regime seems to have gone to some length to encourage such hopes, experimenting with so-called village elections that some saw as the precursors to wider reforms, and talking of the need for more democracy, albeit democracy within the party. But especially in the past decade, things have changed. Chinese officials are increasingly open in their dismissal of Western-style democracy and of what they refer to as so-called universal values. What Xi Jinping and his colleagues have in mind is not a transitional phase of repressive rule to be followed by eventual liberalization, but an efficient, technologically enhanced, and permanent one-party dictatorship, an authoritarian version of the end of history. Developments in the economic sphere parallel and reflect those in the political domain. As I've suggested, from the early 1990s onward, there was an expectation that economic and political reform would go hand in hand, that movement towards greater reliance on markets would encourage and indeed require a steady reduction in the power of the party state. But this hasn't happened. Beyond a certain point, the party was unwilling to relinquish its grip. And that unwillingness, I think, was partly a reflection of ideology. Although they've learned to talk the talk of free trade and globalization, China's rulers are not liberals. They don't regard growth and prosperity as ends in themselves, nor do they expect them to emerge from the workings of freely functioning markets. Like the mercantilists of earlier eras, they believe that wealth begets power and power begets wealth. Resistance to thoroughgoing market reforms is also a result of the incentives embedded in the existing system for directing resources in which party members and their families benefit from their access to political power. And increasingly, the CCP regime's leadership's determination to continue on what they call the path of socialism with Chinese characteristics reflects the belief that these policies are working and that the Chinese model is in some sense superior to the Western model. And I would say those beliefs have grown stronger since the financial crisis of 2008. In retrospect, the pace of reform appears to have slowed shortly after Beijing's accession to the WTO in 2001. And in certain respects, it's gone into reverse under Xi Jinping. In spite of its commitments, China is continuing to use a mix of subsidies, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and other measures to protect domestically based companies and to promote their fortunes in global markets. And its latest trade and industrial programs are intended to catapult it from a perennial follower to a position of leadership across an array of cutting-edge technologies, including semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and new materials. Because they continue to lag behind in many of these sectors that they hope to dominate, Chinese firms, at the direction and with the assistance of the party state, have for some time been using a variety of methods to acquire the necessary technology from the advanced industrial countries, including buying foreign companies, foreign direct investment in the United States and elsewhere, which has increased quite a lot in the last 2 years, compelling foreign firms to transfer core technologies in return for access to the Chinese market, and also stealing intellectual property in massive quantities from foreign companies, research labs, and universities using cyber intrusions and other more traditional methods of industrial espionage. And the problems with all of this are threefold. Some, although not all, of the methods just described represent severe distortions or outright violations of existing rules and international understandings. And there's a growing recognition, not only in the United States, but in other countries in Europe and in Asia, that China has been gaming the system to its own advantage and the disadvantage of its trading partners. Aside from the means that it's using, Beijing's stated goals, as recorded in official planning documents like Made in China 2025, are contributing to this sense of concern. The regime has declared its intention not just to promote the fortunes of Chinese firms in a general way, but to help them achieve a dominant position, specified market shares in a variety of cutting-edge industrial sectors, first in their heavily protected domestic market, and then using that as a platform in foreign markets. And if they're successful, these efforts would have worrisome implications for the prosperity and future growth prospects of many other countries, including the United States. Finally, because almost all of the technologies involved have both commercial and military applications, there's the possibility that China's policies could help it to achieve a meaningful edge in the development of future weapon systems, reducing or perhaps even eliminating a long-standing source of strategic advantage for the United States. China's rulers have long been dissatisfied with the status quo in East Asia, and in particular in the maritime domain off their eastern coasts. And among their long-standing objectives in this domain are the extension of mainland control over Taiwan, which the CCP regards not only as a rebellious province, but because of the demonstrated success of the island's own transition to democracy some 30 years ago, as a dangerous example and an ideological threat. The regime wants to assert control over virtually all of the waters, the surface features, and the resources of the South China Sea and portions of the East China Sea. And most of its claims in the maritime domain go back to the founding of the PRC and even before, but they've lain largely dormant until recently. Finally, the regime evidently seeks an end to America's regional alliances and its military bases, particularly in Japan and South Korea. The Chinese leadership regards these as temporary artifacts of historical accident, the byproduct of what they refer to as unequal treaties that followed the end of the Second World War and have been sustained more recently by what the regime describes as an outdated Cold War mentality. Although Beijing has generally been cautious in saying so, the CCP leadership also clearly regards the U.S. presence as the main obstacle to its achieving its other regional objectives, and more generally, to regaining what it sees as China's rightful place as the preponderant power in East Asia. What's changed in recent years is not so much the CCP's goals, but rather the means that it has available to achieve them and its willingness to exercise its growing power in order to do so. Since the mid-1990s, China's rapid economic growth has enabled it to fund a wide-ranging and sustained modernization of its armed forces. Among other things, the regime has invested heavily in so-called anti-access area denial capabilities, precision conventional strike systems that are capable of locating and hitting both fixed and mobile targets throughout the Western Pacific, including U.S. bases and also surface vessels, including U.S. aircraft carriers. Beijing has also begun to improve its intercontinental range nuclear strike forces in ways that could begin to call into question the credibility of America's extended nuclear guarantees to its allies. And at the other end of the spectrum, the regime has developed and put to use so-called gray zone capabilities, Coast Guard, paramilitary, and maritime construction forces that it's used most recently to build and now to fortify a set of artificial islands in the South China Sea. The aim of China's military buildup is not so much to prepare to fight and win a war with the United States, but rather to win without fighting, to deter U.S. intervention by raising its prospective costs, to demonstrate Washington's inability to prevent the systematic expansion of China's own power and influence, and in the process, to weaken U.S. alliances by undermining confidence in the long-term viability of its security commitments. China's economic growth has also given it an expanding array of non-military tools with which to achieve its objectives. The increasing size and the centrality and importance to all of its trading partners of the Chinese market and China's rapidly expanding role as a provider of aid and investment is helping Beijing to draw others towards it, particularly those in the 360 degrees that surround it. But in addition to attracting others with the promise of profits and aid and investment and so on, Beijing now also has the ability to use economic instruments to punish or merely to threaten those who defy its wishes. And it's done so with increasing frequency in recent years. In 2010, in the midst of a dispute over islands in the East China Sea, Chinese regime evidently cut off for a time exports of so-called rare earth minerals to Japan. More recently, in 2017, the regime stopped Chinese tourist groups from going to South Korea, closed dozens of South Korean stores in China, and blocked imports of some South Korean products to punish the Seoul government for agreeing to allow basing of an American missile defense radar system on its soil. And by some estimates that I've seen, I don't know whether these are authoritative, these unofficial sanctions resulted in a reduction by 0.5% of South Korea's GDP growth last year. And if you know, of course, South Korea is a hugely wealthy country. 0.5% of its GDP is a very large number. The ultimate aim or objective of Chinese strategy appears to be to create a new regional order in Eastern Eurasia, one that would be joined together by trade, transportation, and communication infrastructure, and perhaps by some form of regional political organization, although that's yet to take shape, all of which would have Beijing at the center and America's alliances dismantled or drained of their significance, and the United States pushed to the margins, if not out of the region altogether. Now, it's perhaps unsurprising that a rising power should want to reshape the region surrounding it in ways that better serve its interests and reflect its values. This is what the United States did in the Western Hemisphere in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it's also what Imperial Germany and Imperial Japan tried to do in Europe and East Asia, respectively, at around the same time. But, as these examples may suggest, the fact that something is predictable and even in a sense natural doesn't make it any less of a challenge for other countries. In this case, a weakening of the U.S. position and the emergence of a new Sino-centric regional order would mean the subordination of America's democratic friends and allies, the likelihood of restricted commercial, physical, and virtual access to and through the world's most dynamic region for American actors, private and otherwise, the emergence of a group of countries, including some with considerable wealth, that might support or at a minimum would be reluctant to oppose Beijing on a range of issues, including trade and human rights. And last but not least, the acquisition of a secure Eurasian base from which China could more easily project power into other regions, including some closer to the United States, including the Western Hemisphere. And for over a century now, a central aim of American grand strategy has been to prevent the emergence of just such a situation. The ambitions of China's CCP regime are no longer limited to its immediate neighborhood. Its economic growth is now propelling it out onto the global stage, perhaps more rapidly than some of its top strategists expected, as it seeks out markets, materials, technology, and opportunities for productive investment. Critics have compared some of China's recent behavior in parts of the developing world to that of the 19th and 20th century imperial powers. Extractive economic activity and construction projects that benefit China and Chinese companies more than local populations. So-called debt trap diplomacy, in which China offers loans and then takes control of resources, ports, or other valuable assets when governments can't repay their debts. The establishment of Chinese-controlled enclaves, including for the first time overseas military bases on the territory of other countries. In its pursuit of its material objectives, China's behavior may be similar to that of other great powers of the past, although some of its actions appear archaic by the standards of the 21st century. But China's activities on the global stage also have a distinctive ideological coloration and purpose. China's CCP rulers have long felt themselves to be surrounded and threatened by a structure of international institutions, norms, and rules that, at least in theory, embody liberal principles that are inimical to their own. They regard these as reflections of American interests and of Western preferences rather than so-called universal values. And now they feel themselves to be in a position to push back, to counteract, and if possible, to neutralize what they see as a potential existential threat to their own survival by reshaping elements of the contemporary international system. Chinese theorists have not yet advanced anything resembling a fully developed vision for what they refer to as a more democratic world order. For the time being, Beijing is taking an a la carte approach to the existing system, supporting and seeking to exploit those institutions that serve its interests, like the WTO, I would say the UN Security Council, ignoring those that don't, such as the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, turning others like Interpol to its own purposes, and weakening or subverting those like the UN Commission on Human Rights that might otherwise pose a challenge to its legitimacy. The CCP regime has also begun to develop a new set of new financial institutions like the New Development Bank that aim to circumvent those favored by the West and which, among other things, don't impose conditions for good governance or transparency. And Beijing has sought to promote new norms, like the idea of internet sovereignty, that governments should have the ability to control what goes on in the information domain within their physical borders, that are designed to bolster its own efforts to block what it regards as subversive and dangerous ideas. The increased outflow of Chinese money, most notably under the auspices of Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, is also helping to influence the policies and the institutions of countries in many parts of the developing world, making governments that are on the receiving end of some of this largesse more supportive of Beijing's stance in international institutions, and strengthening the hand of authoritarian rulers with whom Beijing generally prefers to do business, while fueling corruption and weakening democratic practices in places where they have yet to take firm root, including in some parts of the former Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe. These problems are not limited to the developing world. At Xi Jinping's direction, in the last 5 years, the CCP has also stepped up its use of political warfare, or so-called United Front influence operations. And these involve a combination of techniques, including bribery and co-optation, that exploit the openness of democratic societies and are intended to shape the perceptions and attitudes of foreign business, academic, media, and political elites in ways that reduce criticism of the CCP and win support for its policies. And this is a global phenomenon, but it's recently begun to attract attention and has stirred controversy in Australia and New Zealand, and it's beginning to do so here in the United States. It's often said that Beijing does not seek to spread its own system of government or to engage in ideological rivalry with the West. But even if it may once have been true, this is no longer the case. As I've noted, China's rulers are now openly contemptuous of Western-style democracy, and they feel emboldened to offer their own mix of market-driven economics and authoritarian politics as, in Xi Jinping's word from a speech at the end of last year, a new option for other countries. So just as at the start of the 20th century, American policymakers set out to make the world safe for democracy, so at the start of the 21st century, China's leaders seek to make it safe for authoritarianism, or at least for continued CCP rule of China. And they're doing this, I think, or attempting to do this, not only by trying to achieve dominance in their own region, but by working to check and, if possible, to roll back the global spread of liberal democratic ideas and institutions, a trend that seemed unstoppable only a few years ago. So what I've tried to do this morning is to offer a description of what I think the Chinese regime's aims and ambitions are. But obviously, just because they want these things doesn't mean that they'll be able to achieve them. As China's rulers are keenly aware, they face enormous domestic challenges, a slowing growth and a growth model that many Chinese experts themselves would acknowledge has now outlived its usefulness, a rapidly aging population, the accumulated effects of decades of environmental degradation, and continuing corruption and inefficiency. In recent months, there's also been evidence that they face increasing resistance to their assertiveness from other countries, both in the developing world, where there's been controversy about debt trap diplomacy and so on, and in the developed world, including, of course, in the United States. But I would say that this opposition, while it's important, is still nascent, confused, and uncoordinated. It may be because of their awareness of these challenges, both internal and external, that China's leadership has been pushing so hard to achieve its objectives. They see an opportunity in the divisions and preoccupations of the democracies, and they want to take advantage of it. And I would say they see opportunity particularly in what they regard as the dysfunction of our own political system. An effective response to China's rise will require greater focus by our own government, increased mobilization of national resources, and above all, I think, increased cooperation with like-minded countries. And none of this will be possible without a greater understanding of and an agreement on the nature of this challenge. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
So I think we have time for one or two questions. If you'd like to pose a question to Professor Friedberg, please use these mics here in the back.
Professor, thank you for that. My name is Philip Harlow. I'm a student here at George Mason University in the Shah School. I just went on a summer trip to China, and a lot of the things that you've been talking about are certainly my impressions of China before going there. Never been to China before. What came out of the trip, with all the meetings with both government, quasi-government, and traditional, what we might consider for-profit companies, was that there's a large disparity inside China. You talked about some of the internal challenges that they have between the haves and the have-nots. And I will say that in Beijing, they managed to hide their poverty very well, I think perhaps as a result of their preparations for the Olympics several years ago. But what was clear was that the growth in Beijing and the growth in some of the eastern provinces far outweighed the drop-off in the economic development in the west and the north. It strikes me that there's a large correlation between some of those internal challenges that they have now with those that the Soviet Union faced for the last 30 years of communism before Glasnost. So you've given a very, I think, pessimistic view of why we should be worried about China, but I think there are some underlying flaws in the Chinese system which look and taste and feel to me like the Russian system or the Soviet Union system was several years ago.
Yeah, thank you.
Thought I'd offer that comment.
No, thank you very much. That's an interesting and important set of observations. I guess a couple of thoughts first, just generally about inequality. China is now one of the most unequal societies in the world. So while it's true, as the leadership says, that the regime has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, it's also true that there's been this widening disparity between a small group at the top and the great majority of the population. That's not unique to China, but it's a particularly dramatic trend there. And some of that is due to the deliberate policies that the regime has pursued, which effectively suppress savings. People have few opportunities to invest in markets and so on, so they have to put their money in the bank. The regime controls interest rates, and it basically gives very little back and takes that money and invests it as it sees fit. So the policies that the regime has been pursuing are contributing to inequality. There's also this issue that you mentioned of regional inequality, which the regime is well aware and it's deeply concerned about, West in particular versus the East, and some of what it's doing, including some of the things associated with the so-called Belt and Road, seem to be intended to promote development in the Western provinces and out through them into Central Asia and beyond. There's no doubt that they face enormous challenges, as I said, and I think they're aware of that. I believe that in the long run, those challenges will prevent them unless they make fundamental changes in the character of their system from truly achieving the objectives that they have set out for themselves. However, I don't think it's inevitable that they are going to fail, or even if they don't succeed fully, that they can't pose a significant challenge to others, including to the United States. You mentioned the Soviet Union. Soviets are a good example of that. And they had, by the time the Cold War ended, they had endured several decades of essentially zero economic growth, and yet they were engaged in a major military buildup. They actually became more interventionist and active around the world, even as they were encountering those trends. And the Chinese are nowhere near that. They're still a dynamic economy. They have a lot of advantages that the Soviets denied themselves, in particular in the economic policies that they pursued. The Soviets cut themselves off from the outside world as a matter of policy, as the CCP regime did before Deng Xiaoping. So I think the regime is, I hesitate to say they're smarter than their Soviet counterparts, but they're pursuing a strategy that seems to make more sense. That doesn't mean it'll succeed, but it's going to take a while, I think, for it to fail. And in the meantime, China is going to pose, and even if it does fail, China is going to pose enormous challenges to the rest of the world.
Oh, hello. I'm Louise Shelley. I'm a faculty member here. It's very good to hear you talk about corruption because not enough people talk about this issue. But one of the things that I wanted to hear a little bit more about is that China keeps talking about the vulnerability of the pervasive corruption for Chinese stability, but they're using, as you pointed out, corruption as a tool overseas, which may have the same impact of destabilizing the countries in which they're operating. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this disparate approach towards corruption.
Thank you. First, it's a word about corruption in China, and then a word about the political warfare, which I think is what you're referring to. Corruption in China, of course, is an enormous problem. Xi Jinping has undertaken this anti-corruption campaign, which I think is partly, as people point out, a sort of cynical attempt to suppress his rivals, but it's also a serious effort to demonstrate to the Chinese people that the top leadership is serious about this problem of corruption, because it has now become undeniable, the scale of the problem and the heights to which it's reached. That said, it seems to me, for reasons that I tried to suggest, that corruption is actually deeply embedded in the DNA of the current system. And one of the reasons why I think there's been opposition and resistance to movement beyond a certain point towards true marketization is that would reduce the opportunities for people to extract rents through corrupt activities. So it seems to me that they're not going to solve the problem of corruption until they transform the regime. And they can keep conducting these campaigns, and it'll suppress it for a while, but it's going to come back. As far as their activities in other countries, yes, I think you're right. There is, I think, a difference between the so-called political warfare activities that Russia has been engaged in the democratic countries and what China has been doing. I think the Russians have been, as we see with increasing clarity, trying to destabilize the politics of democratic countries and stir division and insecurity and doubt about the legitimacy of democratic institutions. I think the Chinese are not trying to do that. They're trying to penetrate, and with some success, into the establishments of the countries that matter to them to influence and shape the perceptions of rising generations of leaders, and they hope to influence and shape the policies of other governments. The challenge, and of course it's a big subject all of its own, but the challenge, I think, is that to a great extent, the things that they've been doing are not illegal under our laws. And some would say they're not, not even wrong. And what's the problem with hiring a former prime minister in Great Britain to serve on the board of a massive investment fund that's supposed to direct money towards projects along the Belt and Road? And what's wrong with that? Well, I think there are things wrong with it if we have a significant slice of our political and business and other elites adopting positions which serve the interests of another country at the expense of our own. So there's a corrupting effect. I guess the last word I would say is it's different in different countries, and it's worse in some places than in others. I mentioned Australia. The reason the problem has become so extreme in Australia is because they simply didn't have any laws that prevented, for example, foreign nationals from contributing to their political campaigns. So a lot has come to light as a result of the work of some very enterprising journalists in the last couple of years, and they've started to change their laws. I think we're beginning a debate on that, but I think our problems are actually more subtle than those that places like Australia have experienced. And we have to be careful because you don't want to overreact. You don't want to create circumstances in which any Chinese national who's visiting or working in the United States is suspected of espionage, or ethnic Chinese people who are in the United States who are citizens of being regarded in that way. This is dangerous. But the CCP is explicitly exploiting those vulnerabilities in democratic societies to try to shape the policies of foreign governments, and they're not going to stop.
Professor Friedberg, I really want to thank you for getting us off to a terrific start with provocative, thought-provoking, and a little bit dark view of how we might imagine. I think you will be referring to your remarks as the day proceeds of what assumptions should we make about China's interests vis-a-vis things that the United States cares about. So we're really deeply grateful to you for joining us, coming down from Princeton to be with us. I wanted to just, before we give you appropriate applause, just tell everybody we have about a 5-minute break now, and then we'll move to the first panel. So please join me in thanking Professor Friedberg.